There exists a peculiar terror that grips the human heart when confronted with the possibility of being alone. Not the temporary aloneness of an evening spent in solitude, but the deeper, more permanent state of existing without another person to validate one's existence. This fear runs so deep that entire lifetimes are consumed in its avoidance. People rush from relationship to relationship, clinging desperately to connections that drain rather than fulfill them, all because the alternative seems unbearable. Yet, what if this fear itself is the very thing preventing spiritual awakening? What if the path to genuine consciousness requires precisely what terrifies us most? The illusion of completion through another. And the spiritually asleep person operates under a fundamental delusion that another human being can complete them. This belief permeates every layer of their consciousness, shaping their decisions, their anxieties, and their sense of self-worth. They walk through the world carrying an invisible emptiness, convinced that somewhere exists another person whose presence will fill this void. Alan Watts understood that this seeking itself creates the very incompleteness it attempts to resolve. The act of searching for completion outside oneself reinforces the belief that one is incomplete. The spiritually awake person recognizes this trap with crystalline clarity. They understand that no external relationship can ever address an internal misunderstanding. The emptiness they once felt was never a void requiring filling, but rather a misperception of their own nature. When consciousness awakens to itself, it discovers that wholeness was never absent. The search was based on a fundamental error in self-perception. Those who remain spiritually unconscious construct elaborate fantasies around romantic partnership. They imagine that love from another will finally prove their worthiness, that being chosen will validate their existence, that merging with someone else will end their sense of separation from the universe. These fantasies generate tremendous psychological pressure. Every interaction with a potential partner becomes laden with desperate significance. Every rejection confirms their deepest fear that they are somehow fundamentally unlovable or broken. The awakened person sees through this entire structure. They recognize that seeking validation through another person is attempting to solve an existential problem with a relational solution. The feeling of separation from existence itself cannot be remedied by proximity to another person. In fact, entering relationships from this place of lack only multiplies suffering, as two incomplete people attempt to extract wholeness from each other in an impossible exchange. The energy cost of unconscious partnership. Relationships born from unconscious need drain vital energy that could otherwise fuel spiritual development. The unawakened person invests enormous psychological resources into maintaining their partnerships. They carefully manage their partner's emotions, constantly adjusting their behavior to avoid conflict or abandonment. They suppress aspects of themselves that might threaten the relationship's stability. They contort their authentic expression to fit the image their partner prefers. This continuous self-monitoring and self-editing requires tremendous energy. Every conversation becomes a calculation. Every authentic impulse must pass through a filter, asking whether expression will endanger the connection. Over time, this chronic suppression creates a profound disconnection from one's own inner life. The spiritually awake person recognizes this energy drain as incompatible with consciousness development. Awakening requires vast amounts of attention and awareness. It demands the capacity to observe one's own mind without distraction, to sit with discomfort without immediately seeking relief, To question deeply held beliefs even when this questioning destabilizes one's sense of self. When psychological energy is constantly diverted into relationship maintenance, insufficient resources remain for this inner work. The single person who has awakened spiritually finds themselves with abundant energy for self-observation, meditation, contemplation, and the dismantling of ego structures. They are not depleted by the constant negotiation that unconscious relationships demand. Their attention remains available for the most important relationship of all, the relationship with their own consciousness. Furthermore, unconscious partnerships create addictive patterns that reinforce spiritual sleep. The emotional highs and lows of dysfunctional connection become a drug that keeps awareness locked in reactive patterns. The drama of conflict and reconciliation generates intensity that the sleeping mind mistakes for aliveness. The awakened person sees this clearly. They understand that genuine aliveness emerges from presence, not from emotional turbulence. They refuse to trade their consciousness for the temporary relief that codependent connection provides, the false security of coupled existence. Society constructs powerful narratives around the safety and security that partnership supposedly provides. These narratives penetrate deep into the unconscious mind, creating beliefs that feel like obvious truths rather than cultural conditioning. The unawakened person accepts without question that having a partner makes life safer, that being part of a couple provides protection against life's uncertainties, that growing old alone represents a failure or tragedy. These beliefs generate chronic anxiety in single people who have not awakened. They feel vulnerable, exposed, somehow incomplete in their singular existence. This anxiety drives them into relationships that provide the illusion of security while actually creating new forms of vulnerability. Alan Watts pointed repeatedly to the impossibility of genuine security in a constantly changing universe. The awakened person understands that clinging to another person for security is attempting to find permanence in an impermanent form. Partners die, relationships end, people change in unexpected ways. Building one's sense of safety on another person's continued presence is constructing a foundation on sand. Yet the sleeping person cannot help but grasp for this false security. The anxiety of facing existence without this buffer feels intolerable. So they compromise their truth, accept relationships that don't truly nourish them, and sacrifice their spiritual development on the altar of imagined safety. The spiritually awake single person has faced directly into the insecurity that underlies all existence. They have sat with the terror of their own mortality, the groundlessness of being, the absence of any ultimate guarantee. Through this confrontation, they discover something the coupled person perpetually avoids. Genuine security emerges not from external circumstances, but from deep acceptance of insecurity itself. When one stops resisting the fundamental uncertainty of existence, anxiety dissolves. What remains is a profound peace that no relationship can provide and no loss can destroy. This peace is incompatible with the grasping energy that drives most people into partnership. The awakened person remains single not because they fear connection, but because they have discovered a security so deep that external relationships become optional rather than necessary. The clarity of uncompromised consciousness. Entering into partnership inevitably involves compromise. Two separate psychologies, two distinct sets of conditioning, two different paths through life must somehow coordinate. The unawakened person accepts this compromise as the natural cost of relationship. They adjust their preferences, modify their goals, suppress their authentic impulses in service of harmony. Over time, these adjustments accumulate. The person loses touch with their own unfiltered desires and authentic expression. They can no longer distinguish between their genuine preferences and the adapted self they've constructed to maintain the relationship. This loss of self-knowledge creates profound spiritual confusion. The awakened person recognizes that consciousness cannot develop fully when constantly filtered through another person's needs and expectations. Spiritual awakening requires ruthless self-honesty, the willingness to see oneself without the distortions that ego creates. This clarity becomes nearly impossible when one's daily life is organized around accommodating another person. Every choice, every use of time, every expression of preference becomes entangled with partnership considerations. The awakened single person maintains crystalline clarity about their own consciousness. They know their authentic responses because nothing mediates between their awareness and their experience. When anger arises, they observe it directly rather than calculating how its expression might affect a partner. When joy emerges, they feel it fully rather than unconsciously moderating it to match a partner's emotional state. This uncompromised consciousness allows for rapid spiritual development. The awakened single person can follow their inner guidance without negotiation or explanation. If their consciousness calls them to radical simplicity, they can release possessions without concern for a partner's attachment. If their awakening leads them toward extended solitude, they can embrace it without guilt. If their spiritual development requires questioning every belief they've ever held, they can do so without worrying about destabilizing a relationship. This freedom accelerates transformation. The consciousness unencumbered by partnership concerns can move swiftly through the layers of conditioning that maintain spiritual sleep, the sacred solitude of self-discovery. Deep spiritual awakening requires extensive time alone with one's own consciousness, not the superficial alone time of a few hours here and there, but profound extended solitude where the mind can settle into depths impossible to access amid the constant stimulation of relationship. The unawakened person finds this level of solitude uncomfortable, even frightening. Without the distraction of partnership, they confront aspects of themselves they've been avoiding. Uncomfortable emotions surface. Existential questions arise. The chattering of their own mind becomes impossible to ignore. They quickly seek relief through connection, through entertainment, through any activity that prevents this confrontation with their inner life. The spiritually awake person embraces this sacred solitude as essential medicine. They understand that the discomfort the sleeping person avoids is actually the doorway to awakening. In extended aloneness, the constructed self begins to dissolve. The persona maintained for others loses its necessity. The authentic self, buried beneath layers of social conditioning, begins to emerge. This emergence cannot happen while constantly engaging with a partner. The presence of another person, no matter how conscious, inevitably activates certain patterns and suppresses others. True self-discovery requires space where no such activation occurs, where consciousness can observe itself without the complication of relationship dynamics. In this solitude, the awakened person discovers dimensions of being that partnership obscures. They experience their consciousness as complete and sufficient unto itself. They recognize that the sense of separation they once felt was never real. They realize that aloneness and loneliness are entirely different states, that one can be physically alone yet feel profoundly connected to all existence. These realizations are not merely intellectual understanding, but lived experience that transforms one's relationship to reality itself. The person who has tasted this depth of solitary awakening can never again see partnership as necessary. They may choose connection from a place of fullness, but they will never again seek it from emptiness. Alan Watts spoke often of the illusion of the separate self, the ego that believes itself to be an isolated entity navigating a hostile universe. This illusion dissolves most readily in solitude when there is no other person reinforcing the sense of being a separate somebody. The awakened single person has allowed this dissolution to occur. They have discovered what remains when the separate self is seen through. What they find is not the loneliness they once feared, but an interconnection so profound that the question of being single or coupled becomes almost meaningless. They are alone in the sense that no other person completes them. They are never alone in the sense that their consciousness is recognized as inseparable from the consciousness that animates all existence. This realization is the ultimate liberation, and it comes most readily to those brave enough to remain single, while society insists that coupling is the only path to fulfillment.